So welcome everybody. Welcome to Flyway Nights. My name is Corky and I am here with the Yolo Basin Foundation. We do the education programs for the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. And tonight we have one of our own, right? Charlie Russell's going to be talking with us about a program that he's calling It's Not Just Birds, Plants of the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. And we're pretty excited to have Charlie. Not only is he a great educator, but he also is an amazing photographer. And so you're going to see some really beautiful pictures about some of the plants. And I don't know about you, but frequently I'm out there in the wildlife area and I'm going, what is that? So Charlie will be answering some of those questions. A little PR piece too. Next month, April 1st, is Flyway Night. Our speaker will be Eva Butler. She was the founder of Splash, which is the vernal pool program in Sacramento out at Mather. And she's going to be talking about vernal pools, Jewels of the Valley. And she will be kicking off a vernal pool series for us. So she will be the first speaker. And then we'll have several more over April and May. And we're kicking that off because we have a grant from California State Parks to do some education programs about the vernal pools at Grasslands Regional Park here in Davis, California. So we're excited to be able to offer that. So I'm going to change my spotlight over just a couple little things too. Please stay on mute at this point. You can put things into chat and we'll take questions at the end for Charlie. So here comes our speaker, Charlie Russell. There you are, Charlie.
Let me share my screen here. There we go. Okay. So can you hear me okay, Corky? Yep. Okay. Assuming that everyone can hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine. I was on mute. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Okay. So we're going to talk about the plants that you might see in the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. Thank you, Corky, for the introduction. I should point out that I do spend a lot of time taking pictures of flowers, but I have a tendency to focus on native plants, and a lot of the plants we're going to look at tonight are not native, so sometimes the photos may not be up to my usual standards. Okay, and for some reason my keyboard stopped working. There we go. So to start off, I'm going to assume that most people are familiar with the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area, and a few things to get us started here. I'm going to focus on the publicly accessible areas. There's a lot of parts of the Yolo Bypass that have a lot of very interesting plants, but there are areas that show in that lower right-hand corner of that map that you can't easily access for a variety of reasons. So I'm really going to focus on the things that are in the public areas. There is a wide variety of plant habitats there. It's one big wetland, but there's a lot of different smaller habitats in here. The roadways are different than the canals, which are different than the rice fields. So quite a variety of different habitats, but overall, water has a big impact on everything that's out there. There's at least 500 species of plants have been identified in the wildlife area, in the overall wildlife area, and say 380 of those perhaps are native to California. However, the non-natives tend to be more abundant in that there may be a greater variety of native plants, but the non-native plants tend to be the ones that you'll run into more often. I am not going to show you photos of every plant. I don't have photos of all 500 plants, and that would take a lot longer than the time we have allocated. I'm not always going to ID the plants all the way down to species, because sometimes to get them to species, you have to see something that's not available at the time you see the plant. You know, maybe you need some seeds or something. You may need to see the roots. Sometimes it's some microscopic features. You have to have a hand lens or even a dissecting scope to tell them. So won't always get them down to species. All of the photos that we're going to see tonight were taken by me, except for one or two that I'll point out. And they're all ones that have been taken in the wildlife area. So I'm going to break this up by some of these habitat areas. Keep in mind that a lot of these plants aren't restricted to the one particular habitat or another. They may show up in several places, but I'm going to show you where I most commonly find them. And to start off with, we're going to start off with the aquatic areas. Certainly water is a big feature out there, but we're talking about places where there's standing water on a regular basis. Sometimes, like that top photo, we do have flooding out there and everything is underwater. But that's something that doesn't happen every year. And all the plants out there have to have some way of accommodating that. But so I want to start off with something simple, rice. We see a lot of rice out there. Generally two types of rice. The white rice has those nice green, very, very evenly, they almost look like a mowed lawn out there sometime. And we have the wild rice, which if you look at it, it's a bit wilder. It doesn't have that even top to it. And that's a fairly common thing. We don't usually think about that when we're looking at plants in the area. But one of the reasons I want to point that out is because another common plant that we see out there that I get asked about a lot is watergrass. A lot of different common names for this. There's probably several species of this. One of the reasons this is a big pest in rice fields because this plant is, again, a wild plant, so it tends to not grow at that same height as those very even white rice fields. That means the plant's sticking up. When the harvesters come through, those harvesters are adjusted for the height of the rice plants, and these plants sticking up higher don't get pulled into the harvester, they get knocked over, and therefore they spread their seeds there and propagate themselves quite a bit. Also, the plant is very fibrous, so those rotating bars on the harvesters can get tangled up with the stuff. So the rice farmers don't like to see that. Another really common one, I'm starting off with the easy ones, cattails, the flat leaves of the cattails. There's probably 3 species of them out there. They can be difficult to tell apart. The broadleaf and the narrowleaf, there's a few millimeters difference in the average width of those leaves, so they can be hard to tell apart. In general, if you look at that center photo, you've got the spike at the top, and that's where the male flower is on this plant. And the hot dog part of that is the female flower. There could be 250,000 seeds easily in that head. And if you look at the one on the right, you see there's a little gap between the male flower and the female flower. So it's not very conspicuous, but that's one of the ways we tell the difference between some of these species. The problem is, of course, that that's not real constant. You can't always be definitively tell which one it is by that. The broadleaf one is the most common, in my opinion, out there. Doesn't have that gap. The narrowleaf, we see quite a bit of that. It has a gap in there, maybe a little more noticeable than the gap in that picture. There's a third species that also has that gap. I actually haven't come across it yet, but the hot dog portion of it is a lighter cinnamon brown. Now there's other ways of keying these out, but that involves tearing the leaves off, looking at the base, and it's hard to do. These plants were used by the Native Americans for a lot of things. The shoots are edible. The pollen is edible. It has a starchy root that's edible. You can take the fluff that comes from the hot dog part, the female flowers, and that can be used to stuff in a mattress, or it's absorbent. They use it to line diapers. And the leaves are very fibrous, can be used for a variety of things. So a very useful plant out there. The rhizomes, the roots of those plants can spread 10 feet in a growing season. It's a very aggressive growing plant if it's not managed. in association with many of the rice fields, we'll see arrowhead. This is something that's a lot of people don't notice until it starts blooming. Those flowers are probably the size of a $50 or so. They are native plants. We have at least 2 species out there that I've found, and you can tell the difference between the species by those leaves that you see in the right-hand pictures. Arrowhead, the name Sagittaria, sagittate means arrow-shaped, and you can see that arrow-shaped leaf. The really long and thin one is the long-lobed arrowhead. The most common one I see is the broadleaf one at the top. There's both separate male and female flowers on the same spike. The male flower, which is at the top of the screen there, is usually lower down on the flower stem, and the female flowers in the lower left are going to be at the top. Very similar plant, burrhead, which is also native, that top one there, but you can see the leaves are quite different than the arrowhead. Those are those round ovate types of leaves. It still has that 3-petaled white flower. The flowers are a little smaller. We're talking about maybe quarter size typically. The one on the bottom is the lance leaf water plantain. Again, the leaf looks very different than the Sagittaria. That's actually, even though it's a non-native one, I enjoy finding that because those flowers, which are maybe the size of my thumb or smaller, have a delicate pink cast to that, and we'll see those. If you go into the rice fields after they've been harvested and they dry down, you'll often find that one in abundance in certain areas. In the corners of rice fields, usually places where they have the gates that go from one field to another, so the water's moving a little bit. The rice may not have filled in quite as densely there, and you get some light in there, you get the Gila River water hyssop, a nice name to twist your tongue sometimes. It's native to just California and Nevada. A nice aquatic plant. It's not terribly invasive, but if you get some light in there, it can spread out. So all of that white in that center picture spreading across is this particular plant. Now, and another one that's very common out there that everyone has probably seen, the tule or hardstem bulrush. It has a cylindrical leaves, and it's important to note that the flowers are at the tip of, actually that's not the leaf, it's a stem. The flowers are at the tip of the stem, not at places along the sides. There are some other similar species that don't get as tall as this, but the flowers may show up at junctions along the side of the leaf or the stem. A very useful native plant to the Native Americans. It's a building material. You can build shelter with this. They built boats with this because it's very water repellent. And the starchy rhizome, the root, can also be used for food. There may be several species out there, but this particular one is by far the most common as far as I've been able to tell. Birds really like this. There's a lot of seeds in those tips. Excuse me, got to catch my throat because I've been out in the field a lot. One that we see way too much of, the floating primrose willow. There's a couple of different common names for these. There's several species and subspecies out there, and there's been some discussion about whether perhaps one of the subspecies that is out there may be native, but I think it's pretty much been determined now that all of them there are not native to California. They come from the Southwest U.S. Grows massive mats across the canals, usually where water isn't moving as much. It's interesting because if you look in that bottom right-hand picture where you can see some of the stems across there, when the waterways dry down, this plant wants its water. It'll literally crawl out of that ditch trying to find some water. You see these runners running across the sides towards other water sources. And it looks like something that's just trying to haul itself out of the ditch and find a new place. I used to think that we could tell the different species by how many petals on the flowers, but because one of them, like the one at the top there, is hexapetala. You think, okay, that's got 6 petals, and the other one has 5 petals, but unfortunately there's a lot of variation in them, and you can't go by that. I look at the leaves, and you see the leaves there by the yellow flower and how those come to a point where the leaves on the bottom one, which is a different species, they're more spoon-shaped, and that's one way to tell the 2 different species. But pretty much you have to get down there and get a close look at the plants, and if they're down in the ditch, it's hard to reach. This is a very invasive plant, and a lot of times you'll see big piles of this along the sides of the canals because the wildlife managers are out there with a backhoe just digging the stuff out of the canals. Another one that we see, it's probably not as common out there, but we do have the common water hyacinth. I usually find this in the tow drain, which is the channel that borders the eastern side of the wildlife area. And it's interesting, this is probably, on a worldwide basis, this may be the most troublesome aquatic pest in the world. Produces a lot of vegetative material, clogs waterways. It's a big problem in certain areas down in the delta south of us. Every once in a while, when we have a massive flood event in the bypass, I think this stuff gets swept out into the delta, because for a couple of years after a big flooding event, we don't see a lot of this out there, and it starts building itself back up. Very pretty flower. You can see why some people liked it for gardens and things, but a major pest. One of the problems with this is that it tends to be down a steep bank in the tow drain, so it's hard to get a good close-up of those photos of those flowers. Okay, so lots of times you go out in the canals and you see this scummy surface, and you think, oh, it's just there's this polluted, scummy water out there. But really, it's a very interesting plant. It's a fern, Azolla, probably Azolla ficuloides. It's hard to tell this Azolla apart from another one. It is native to California, but it's found worldwide. And it's interesting because this plant has an association with a cyanobacteria. There's little pockets in the leaves there that hold the cyanobacteria. And that cyanobacteria, the nostoc, is a nitrogen fixer. So it's pulling nitrogen out of the air and essentially fertilizing the fern that in turn is protecting it and giving it some minerals. In Southeast Asia, sometimes this is used as a fertilizer. You harvest your rice, you let this grow in the paddy for a while, then dry it down and maybe till it back into the soil, and it's used as a natural fertilizer. Not really, it's not a pest, but it can be kind of unsightly sometimes. When the weather gets cold, you start seeing those red colors to it. So the next habitat I want to move to is we're going to move out of the standing water to the water's edge. And if you look in that upper left-hand photo, this is a place that it's a pond. The green area, the pond is dried down, and that would be where there was standing water for a period of time. And you look at the edge there, and you see a lot of plants in a stripe along the edge. And then behind that are some taller plants, and behind that there's some white flowering plants and other things. So we have these essentially microhabitats here. And now I'm talking about ones that are in that right on the edge. They really don't like to be in standing water, but they want to be close to water usually. Doesn't mean that they're restricted to that, but we'll see that. So in that picture in the upper right with the people standing around, we're talking about those plants that are dried out, that are right there next to them, not the ones that are out there where the ducks are. One that you'll see, well, two of them that you'll see quite often, lady's thumb and willow weed, the persicarias. These, I used to think I really had the different ones keyed out pretty well. If you have a really rosy one, you've got the lady's thumb. If it's white to maybe a little light pink, the willow weed. The problem is that there's a lot of variation in there. Sometimes you can get the lady's thumb getting very faintly pink. Sometimes you get a little bit more color in the willow weed. And then I started looking at the leaves, and the leaves of the lady thumb usually have a big red spot on the leaf. But as you can tell from that picture there is no big red spot. So that's a characteristic that helps, but it isn't always there. If you want to tell which species it is, you have to look in that picture in the upper right. That's where the juncture of the leaf and the stems are, and there's this little sheath there, and you see there's some little fuzzy filaments at the top. And if it has those bristles like that, a lot of those bristles, it's lady's thumb. If it doesn't have any bristles, it's willow weed, probably. Both have very similar growth patterns and habitats. The young leaves of the lady's thumb have been used for food. That's one from Eurasia. It contains a chemical called persicarin, which people have been exploring to see if it has some medicinal characteristics, but there's probably not enough of that in there to be worthwhile. A couple of common plants we'll see along the edges are the flat sedges, the nut sedges. The one on the right is the one I see most commonly. Used to call that umbrella plant because that top with the sprayed leaves out there looks like kind of like an umbrella that's been blown in the wind. The stems tend to be triangular, although not necessarily. The one on the bottom, I don't see that as often myself. Doesn't have as striking an umbrella type of shape, but that's an interesting one because that plant, found worldwide, has been in association with people for a very long time. It's considered to be perhaps one of the longest term cultivated plants that people have had. They find indications that it was cultivated in prehistoric times, perhaps. It has edible tubers. Sometimes they're called earth almonds or tiger nuts. In ancient Egypt, the yellow nut sedge was a very important food. I don't know that it had wide use by the Native Americans. I can't find any indication of that. But it's interesting. It's a theme that we may come back to in other times. There are some plants that have been in association with people for a very long time, and there's a lot of they're important as food producers. Probably anyone who's gone through the wildlife area has seen this toothpick weed. It's got a couple of names, but I like toothpick weed because when it starts to dry up, like that center photo, it looks like a bundle of toothpicks there. This is very often confused with another plant called Queen Anne's lace. When I started as a volunteer with the Yolo Basin, everyone was talking about the Queen Anne's lace, but if you look at this closely, this is not Queen Anne's lace. And in fact, I keep on looking for Queen Anne's lace and I can't find any out there yet. The difference is very difficult to tell. I have that picture of the seeds there. These are great seed producers, produce a lot of seeds, but the seeds are relatively smooth. They're not fuzzy. And the Queen Anne's lace should have fuzzy seeds. Perhaps the stem would be a little fuzzy. This is a plant that was used by the ancient Egyptians to treat kidney stones. It hasn't been studied as a medicine for people yet. It has been studied in rats, and there's some indication that maybe it works on helping with kidney stones. The problem is that there's several compounds in here, one of which is a muscle relaxant, and there's several side effects from some of the ingredients in here. So it's probably not going to be used for that purpose widely. Now, I want you to look in that lower left-hand corner and get a good idea what the leaves look like on this. You got those frilly, almost a dill-like leaf. Here's another plant that looks very similar to that plant, but you can see the leaves look more like kind of like a parsley or something. And it's really important to the flowers when the heads are filled out very fully, looks very similar to the other one, but this is poison hemlock. 6 to 8 of those leaves will kill you if you eat them. So you don't want to go around eating, pulling off leaves and eating them because it looks like parsley. One of the really good tells for this is to look in the right-hand photo. You can see that there's that purple mottling. And that is very, very typical of the poison hemlock. All parts of the plant are toxic. It can cause respiratory and renal failure. So it's not something that you want to it's something that you need to be able to recognize out there. Don't quite see it in the same places as the toothpick weed. This tends to be a little bit more damper areas. Velvet leaf. This is probably my favorite plant out there, or at least my second favorite plant. Unfortunately, it's not native, but it's very appropriately named. If you find this, those leaves feel like velvet. They're just wonderfully soft. The plant produces a lot of seeds, so the birds like it. And if you find the seed heads on this that have started to dry out, you take it and you can shake it over your palm. It's like a little salt and pepper shaker. You shake these leaves out, the seeds out, and you have these little heart-shaped seeds. The flowers tend to be inconspicuous. They tend to stay tucked underneath the leaves. You don't see them a lot. The plant was cultivated in Asia. It's very, very fibrous. There's a very strong fiber. The leaves are edible. The seeds are edible. And there may be some medicinal features here. The leaves contain a small percentage, a small percentage of a chemical called rutin, R-U-T-I-N. And rutin is something that's used as a soothing lubricant treatment if you have irritated tissues. So I would guess that means if you take that velvet leaf and rub it across an irritated spot, it'll make you feel better. I can tell you that I take these every time I'm on like one of the bat tours and we're out there. I'm always grabbing this leaf and showing people and rubbing it against my skin because it really feels good. This plant is one that we're seeing more and more of, and it's very unfortunate. Broadleaf peppergrass, that can get up 4, 5, 6 feet tall sometimes. Don't usually see it quite that tall, but it's a very aggressive plant. It's becoming one of the major pests in wetlands in California because it tends to crowd out the native plants, and it's growing very rapidly. It's difficult to control. But there again, this plant is used, it exists in many places in the world. And you may notice that a lot of times when I'm labeling this, where these plants come from, a lot of them are coming from the Mediterranean area because the climate in the Mediterranean area is very, very similar to the climate in California. This plant in the Himalayas, this is actually used as a foodstuff. They take, if times are rough, you take those leaves, you have to boil them, you have to let them soak for 4 or 5 days, changing the water several times. And if you do that, you have something that's kind of like spinach, and it is edible. But I think you have to be pretty desperate to want to go to all that work. Keeping up with the theme of poisonous plants, we do have nightshade out there. Nightshade is a toxic plant. If you look in the upper right, there's a list of a number of the chemicals that are found in nightshade and the nightshades we have around here. And that's a pretty dire list of things. All parts of the plant can be toxic. They can cause cramping and diarrhea and vomiting. But it's interesting, those purple berries are used as a food source. The people use them in stews and desserts. And I often sometimes get into arguments with people. They say, "Oh, I eat that, it's no problem." The interesting thing is you want to make sure you get just the berries and not some of the stems, not some of the leaves with it. There's a lot of variability from one place to another. You could find this down perhaps in the Bay Area and eat them and it'll be fine. But you go to another place, the toxin levels may vary in your local population of them, and you may find that it causes problems in other areas. Can cause cramping, diarrhea, and vomiting. Children tend to be more susceptible. The leaves build up a high amount of nitrates, and so that's a hazard for livestock. Tiny little white flowers. These close-ups make them look like they're big, but they're very tiny little white flowers, and we tend to find this underneath other plants that are giving it a little bit of shade. But I find that quite often. There's supposedly 2 species out there. One's native and one's not native, but there's some discussion about, well, maybe it's really all one species, because they're extremely difficult to tell apart. And I've had people show me photos and diagrams of how to tell the 2 of them apart, and it's really tough. Pretty purple asters. We have several species of these purple asters, and the top 2 are either Pacific aster or Sus and Marsh aster. It's really difficult to tell those 2 species apart. You have to look at some features that aren't shown in this, and in fact, there's a lot of variability in there, so it can be very hard to tell them apart. But you can tell by the measurement with my precision measuring device that I have in the picture there, that the one on the bottom has a much smaller flower. That's the one you'll most likely see, the annual salt marsh aster, which may or may not be native. There's some subspecies that are native and some that aren't, so it's hard to tell them apart. But you'll see these big sprays of these little purple aster flowers. It's very pretty. So let's move on to grasslands and dry ponds. Now that's a little difficult when we talk about the public areas out there. We don't have any really many traditional grasslands out there, because pretty much everything out there is disturbed and has some water. There's more true grassland areas when you go further south than the public areas. But a lot of these areas act just like a grassland. When the water dries down, or if the water hasn't been in an area for a length of time, with the types of soils we have out there, you get these areas that are functionally the same as a grassland. But we're talking about plants that don't want a lot of water. They're not really associated with water. They're associated with flatter open spaces. The picture in the upper right there is one of the dried down shorebird areas south of parking lot A, just to give you an example. One that, if you go out in these areas, when these areas are dried out, that you are bound to find is pennyroyal. You just walk through a field, and if you can smell that strong mint smell, you know it's there. The pennyroyal is non-native. There is a native American wild mint that's supposed to be out there, but I haven't found any of it yet. It's a little difficult to tell this one away from the native one. The problem with this, that you get that wonderful minty smell, and people think, well, can I use a tea from that or use it? Unfortunately, the oil is toxic and fatal if you ingest any amount of it. And in fact, the oil of this is another plant that's been in association with people for a very long time. And the ancient Greeks used a derivation of this to induce abortions. So, not something that you want to go out there and ingest very much of, but it smells wonderfully. It's interesting. I'll find this, I'll squeeze some and have people sniff it. And some people love the smell, and some people are just really hate that smell. Another plant that is hard to miss out there, the Cockle Burr. And comparing this plant to the velvet leaf, it's the direct opposite. Those leaves feel like sandpaper. So if you don't have flowers and seeds on them, that's one way to tell the difference between this and velvet leaf, is just rub that leaf and you'll tell right away. People tend not to notice the flowers. The flowers are fairly inconspicuous on this. But what you do notice are those big old burrs. Got the hooks on them. There's some discussion about how this plant may have been the inspiration for the Swiss engineer who developed Velcro. This plant and another similar plant called burdock both are found naturally in the area where this engineer was living. And so it's not clear whether it's Cockle Burr or burdock which was used as the inspiration, but they have the same idea. I can find resources that say it was one plant, and I find conflicting ones that say it's the other plant. If you go to the Velcro Museum, if we research the Velcro Museum, they mix the two terms up. So sometimes they talk about one, sometimes they talk about the other. So I don't think anyone really knows. If you have a dog, well, you're not supposed to have a dog in a wildlife area, but if you walk through there, you'll find these things stuck to you. The seeds and young shoots contain a significant concentration of an extremely toxic chemical, which a long name I'm not going to try to pronounce, can cause liver failure. So another plant that's not to be used if you're desperate for something. However, the Zuni natives in Southwest US did use this for some of their ceremonies. I'm not sure what the purpose was that they're using it for. Curly dock. Couple of docks out there. The most common ones that I see are curly dock and to a lesser degree fiddle dock. And there's probably 4 or 5 species of docks out, probably 7 species of docks out there. Tend to tell them apart by looking at the seeds, whether they have those tooth margins or not. If you look on the right-hand side, curly dock leaves are eaten. Maybe the seeds, I'm not sure about that. The problem is you have to limit your intake of this because they're very high in oxalic acid. So if you eat a lot of this, you're likely to start developing kidney stones. So safe to eat, but just don't use it all the time. Okay, this is my favorite plant. Velvet leaf is number 2 to this one. Flat-faced Dunningia, found only in California. We typically think of this as a vernal pool plant, but some of those wetland areas, when the shorebird areas, when they dry down, they tend to be functionally the same as a vernal pool. So that wonderful field in the upper right is some of the shorebird areas south of parking lot A. There's also a really nice spot that's just to the east of parking lot A that many years has a nice show of this. Very low statured, 5, 6, 7 inches at the most if there's a lot of it out there. And it's interesting because there are several color variations you'll see. You can see that the white one in the lower left, same plant. We just get their annual plants, and then there tends to be some color variations that come up in annual plants like this. I found approximately 5 different color variations out there, pink ones, white ones, some with stripes, the pretty blue ones that are the most typical. And this is a plant that I look at in a lot of different vernal pool areas around the Central Valley. For whatever reason, the Yolo Basin Wildlife Area is the place where I find the greatest number of these color variations. I'm not sure why that is. Now, I want you to look in that, keep in mind that picture in the upper right. So this is something that comes out usually in May, depending on what the water regime is like and how much rainfall. But keep that picture in your mind, because this next picture in the upper right, that's the same place probably about 4 weeks later. The Dunningia have died down. They're annuals, they don't stay there a huge long time. And some years we get these massive, I can't call it a bloom, but this explosion of dodder, which is a parasitic vine. Sometimes you see just a little bit of it out there. Sometimes you get massive fields of it like that. There are no roots, there is no leaves, no chlorophyll. No, I shouldn't say there's no leaves, there's technically a leaf, but there's no chlorophyll and there's no roots to this when it's mature. Looks like someone's been spraying silly string across there. Hard to tell what species there are. There's several have been identified out there. You have to look at some very minute characteristics of those flowers. And it's even looking at this picture of the flowers, I'm not really sure which species this is. It spreads by seeds, but it also spreads vegetatively, which means that when they go out there to mow this area or they disc this area, if there's any dodder out there, they're essentially spreading it further around, because you can break off a few fronds of those and put them in the right place. It'll keep on growing and attach itself to some plants. This particular one is most likely a native one. Another one we see in these drier areas, there's a couple of vetches out there. The one I see most often is the hairy vetch, the one on the left. The vetches are one of those weeds from the Mediterranean area that was brought over on purpose because these are used as a cover crop. You grow these between your regular crops or either in the rows between your crop rows, or after you've harvested, or before you harvest, you may plant this. They're both good nitrogen fixers. And in fact, the one on the right, I see that they're using that in some of the fields in the Conway Ranch up near Woodland. There's quite extensive amount of spring vetch and others that was actually planted there so they can use it as a fertilizer for the fields. The hairy vetch tends to be a bit invasive. If it's unchecked, it can take over a field, but we don't see that as a big, I don't see it as a big problem in the wildlife area. So now I want to move on to our roadside. We've gotten away from the edge of the water. We're moving up into its drier. Ruderal essentially means disturbed soils. Now, pretty much everything out there is disturbed in some way, but we're usually talking about places where there's been some road work or it's dug up. And if you look at that one on the lower right, now I'm cheating a little bit. The one in the lower right is from Glide Tool Ranch, which is in the non-public area of the bypass. But I had to put that in there because that beautiful yellow swath, which is Triphosaria, butter and eggs, that's a road. And that road is slightly higher than the flooded areas around it. And this plant just loves that spot. And every once in a while we get these big massive blooms of that out there, but primarily in these disturbed areas. One that I hope you don't find. Every time I find this, I talk to Mary Scheit and tell her where it is and ask her to please go get it. Puncture vine. Good amount of that shows up in parking lot C. I also found these pictures actually came from down near the check-ins, the Hunter check-in station at the south edge of the public area. You look at those seeds that are in the palm of my hand there, and they're constructed in such a way that no matter how those seeds fall, there's always one spike pointing straight up. A very interesting design that was used in medieval warfare. They created devices that had the same configuration to spread across the field to prevent a cavalry charge, because your horses would come out and no matter how these things fell on the ground, they'd always have a spike sticking up. The spikes are very strong. And that picture in the lower right is the bottom of my boot, my hiking boot. And you can see that the seeds have embedded in that. And I actually had to take a pair of pliers to get all the spikes out of that boot. So they're very, very tough. The plant is a little bit toxic to livestock. It's kind of interesting that we see this out there because this is a plant that was introduced in the United States, in California, roughly around 1902. And we typically think that it's been controlled because they introduced a weevil that eats this. And it's one of the very successful stories of they introduced an insect to control this, and that insect doesn't actually go after any plants that we want to keep. So it's something that I don't see a lot except for in the wildlife area. And I'm not sure why that is. That's a great Latin name or scientific name for a plant, Tribulus terrestris. Wild radish. Two species of wild radish. And I used to think that we could tell them apart. You got the yellow one, which is the raffinastrum. The white and pink ones are the sativus. But these plants tend to hybridize. And so you get a lot of color variations and crossovers. The picture in the center bottom, the drawing, shows you the differences between the seed pods of the two, where the raffinastrum, the yellow one, has a very strong constrictions. But then again, with the hybridization of these two species, you get some intermediate ones. So sometimes it's hard to tell which one it is. Here's another plant that came from the Mediterranean. It's another plant that has a very long association with humans. So these plants have been taken and cultivated, and they've derived several subspecies from this, and worked on breeding them over the years. The Raffinesis, the sativus, is a different subspecies of the sativus, are your green and red radishes that you may grow in your garden. The Raffinastrum, that has been bred to become the daikon radish. So these wild radishes, again, association with people for a very long time. They've derived a lot of our common vegetables out of this. You see this along the roadside quite often. Chicory, when things are getting nice and dry out there, we start to see chicory blooming. The leaves are supposed to be edible, but I have a hard time seeing that being very useful because they're very bristly, or can be very bristly. Another plant that has a long time association with people. There are several cultivated subspecies derived from wild chicory, one of which is root chicory, which you may have heard of people talking about chicory as a coffee substitute. That's the root chicory was derived from this wild species. Belgian endive, if I pronounce that right, not being a cook. Belgian endive is a subspecies of this particular one, not the curly endive, but just the Belgian endive. Quite a pretty little flower. Common sunflower. With the weather we've been having this last year and this year, we are seeing this almost year round, it seems. Native to North America, the same species as you see in the cultivated fields. And I originally thought that these were escapees from the cultivated fields that as we see them in the bypass area. But I recently had a discussion with a recently retired USDA sunflower specialist who moved to this area from up north. And he says, no, those ones that are out there in the bypass are the native ones. They're not the cultivated escapees. You know, when we're on bat tours with Corky, I'm always going over to the side and looking at the sunflowers just as the sun is starting to set and looking closely at them. And as you've seen that bottom picture, which is a picture provided to me by Martha Ozenoff, you may find a cluster of these longhorn digger bees there. All those bees, these are all males. This is the bachelor pad. The males gather together on the flowers to rest overnight. They really prefer the sunflowers. The females are safe at home in their burrows that are dug in the ground. They kick the males out, so the males have to congregate in the bachelor pads. Dog fennel, which is also called stinking chamomile. And if you walk through a bunch of this, you'll understand why it's called stinking chamomile. It's very resinous, has a very strong smell to it. Pretty much anytime you see a white daisy looking flower out there, it's most likely going to be this one that I see very commonly. Gumweed or gum plant. I had one of the other docents was asking me, well, which is it? Is it gumweed or gum plant? Because I tend to flip between the two of them, but you can find that common name is used, both those names are used as the common name for it. There's several species that have been identified as being out there by some sources, but so far, everything I've been able to find is this one particular one, also called Great Valley gumweed sometimes. This is a plant, it's native to the area, was used by the Native Americans to help lung congestion. It's a good expectorant, it can help decrease the lung congestion. There are some reports that some of the chemicals there are possibly a mild hallucinogen, so you want to be careful playing around with this thing by itself. It has those very distinctive spiky buds that have a little bit of a gummy resin there that even though those are really spiky looking, when they're green like that, they're actually quite soft. It's a very pretty plant, and that one is a perennial, so we'll tend to see that, excuse me, we'll see that on a year-round basis sometimes. Mustards. I am not going to tell you how to tell the difference between all these different mustards. That's something I'm still working on figuring out myself. There's quite a few different species of mustards, as I list down the side. Again, a plant, these are primarily Mediterranean, but also maybe a little bit into Asia. Some of these species have been in association with people, again, for a very long time. So if you look at the Sherlock Mustard, for example, the Sherlock Mustard is something that has was very important in history. In the Great Famine of Ireland, when the potato crops failed, the leaves of this were one of the food crops, food substitutes that got people through the Great Famine. You take the leaves and can boil them and eat them like spinach. You had to be really hungry to do this because there's some chemicals in there that can give you an upset stomach as well. It's not going to kill you, but it's going to give you an upset stomach. But if that's what you have to eat, that's what you do. The seeds of the Sherlock mustard are ground to make the condiment. There's oil that's used for lubricating machinery. The Hirschfeldia, the short pod mustard, is one that also has edible leaves that apparently don't have the upsetting qualities. The black mustard, Brassica nigra, that's what we usually think of as the common mustard in California. That's the one that was brought over supposedly by the missionaries as they came up through California from down south. That's the original condiment mustard, the black mustard, but it's probably not used as much for creating your yellow mustard now as it used to be, because the seeds have a very hard coat and it's a little bit harder to process. So commercially, they're moving over to some different species of mustard. Now, Brassica rapa, the field mustard, again, a plant that has had a long association with people. And over time, in the Mediterranean as well as in Asia, they've created some cultivated subspecies of that. And that's the source of things like bok choy, Napa cabbage, and our cultivated turnips are all subspecies of the field mustard, and probably some other vegetables that don't come to mind at this time. It gets to be a little difficult to tell them apart. You have to see the leaves at the base of the plant, how the leaves attach to the stem, a variety. Probably the easiest one to tell from all is that bottom center one, the short pod mustard, because the pods, the seed pods, have that curve to them instead of being long and straight. But they all have that same characteristic of the 4 petals. Thistles. There's a lot of thistles out there. I'm not a fan of thistles. They're all non-native from generally the Mediterranean areas. The one I see most commonly is, perhaps because it's easiest to identify, is the milk thistle. Those leaves have that mottled, curdled milk look to them, very spiny. You can go to a natural food store and find extracts of the seeds of that are supposed to be good for your liver ailments, but there to date hasn't been any scientific proof that there is any value to that. The plant can be toxic to cattle if they eat any amount of it. The bull thistle in the center, a little bit spikier, can also be pretty big. That plant's found in many parts of the world, and in fact, that bull thistle is the national plant of Scotland. If you look at their national crest, you'll see that that very typical bull thistle flower is there. It's actually a plant that's beneficial to birds because it does produce a lot of seeds. The bottom one, the Italian thistle, the flower is much narrower and smaller. It has those thinner, very spiky leaves. That one can be a big problem if you have cattle. It's a problem in grazing land. Mallows, all the ones on the right are non-natives, but the alkali mallow is a native one. The alkali mallow is a very small plant. I have a tough time finding pictures that have the flowers because the flowers don't stay open very long. The leaves of the bull mallow and probably the cheeseweed as well are edible, although the bull mallow is more likely. Again, it's one of those things that you can take and boil it and eat it like spinach. And it has an interesting history because back in 1948, the battle for Jerusalem, the besieged Jewish population actually subsisted quite a bit on the leaves of bull mallow. There may be some anti-inflammatory characteristics with the cheeseweed, the bottom one, although probably not extensively. Those two are the two on the right are difficult to tell apart sometimes unless you see the flowers. There's some differences in the seeds, like in the lower right picture, you see a seed capsule there, but there's a lot of variability there. This is one that people tend not to notice because it's very low growing, forms mats out there, and is my favorite common name, turkey tangle fogfruit. I have no idea where that name came from. It is native, it's very low growing and mat forming. And in fact, I have a commercial cultivar of that as a ground cover in my front yard. It's very, very low water requirements. It grows rapidly. In fact, it may be growing too rapidly. It's starting to bury some of my other plants in my garden. Star thistles, everyone who lives in Northern California has probably seen star thistle. The non-native, in the Mediterranean, it's not a pest because there are insects and fungi and different things that keep it in check so it doesn't take over. But when it came over here, introduced accidentally, it didn't come over with the pest that controlled it. They're trying to develop a variety of different controls for this. They're having a tough time. It is a good pollen and nectar source for our honeybees. Not so great for the native bees, and it's a painful plant, I guess is the best to say. Keeping up with the theme of poisonous plants, we do see Jimson wheat out there, a couple of different varieties that can be difficult to tell apart. You have to look at the shapes of the leaves. Jimson, one of the ones out there is native and one is not native. All parts of the plant are toxic. It has scopolamine and atropine and things like this. It also has some hallucinogenic properties. And in fact, some of those were used by the Native Americans in some of their ceremonies. Part of the problem is that it's not really a great hallucinogen to take because it's also what we call a deliriant. It tends to make you feel delirious. It's not always a good experience, I'm told. I've not taken it myself. You see those spiky seed pods. If you get a picture of it, you want to see whether the seed pod is hanging down or sticking straight up. That's one of the ways you can start to think about what species it is. It's a very pretty plant. Field bindweed, we see a lot of this along the roadside. Much smaller flower than the other one. Everything I've found out there so far is the non-native field bindweed. I haven't found any of the similar native ones. This is actually, at one time, this was the plant that the most money was spent in California in trying to control it. It can really choke out a lot of your native plants. And in fact, it's a big problem in where they're trying to restore riparian corridors. If it's established in here, it can just wipe out the plants that you're replanting in areas. So it can be pretty aggressive. It's not a big problem out in the wildlife area because it doesn't like as much water as we have out there. The wild lettuce. Sorry about the bad title up there. We do have a wild lettuce. What you want to look at are those very spiky leaves over there. The leaves are supposed to be edible. I'm not sure why I'd want to eat something that's spiky. The sap might have some medicinal uses. Two species you have to get a good picture of the leaves to tell them apart. I don't have a lot of good diagnostic pictures of this particular one. You see a lot of this along the roadsides. One that we'll see a lot of out there, sow thistles. And right now there's a ton of this growing along the roads leading south from parking lot A. The two species, we have the prickly one, which you can see those very prickly leaves at the top, which is one I tend to run into most often, and the common sow thistle, which does not have the spiky leaves. But if you look at that lower center picture, you see that very typical shape of the buds before they open. And that's one of the ways to tell the sow thistle apart from some of the other very similar yellow flowered plants out there. We also have a bristly ox tongue, again from the Mediterranean. Instead of having those twisty types of leaves, it has these very flat leaves with the bumps on them. And the flowers don't have that typical shape that we saw with the prior plants. But we'll see this one. These are later in the summer when you start seeing these as things dry out. There are some chemicals in this that have been used historically to control internal parasites. So there's some additional value there. And I put this together so you can get a good idea. The flowers look very similar, although there are some differences. And we start looking at the leaves with the ox tongue, the sow thistle, and the wild lettuce. Most of those are very bristly, but there's a different configuration to the leaf, and that's how you're going to be able to identify the three of them. And with that, that's all I'm going to go through today. So if you, some good resources for identifying plants are Calflora and iNaturalist. I don't have a page set up yet on my website that's specifically oriented towards the Yolo Bypass. I hope by next year I'll have a page that goes through with all these things and helps show what the plants are. But I'm still trying to accumulate some photos before I do that. And I do have some articles where I write about places to hike to see wildflowers, and I post current flower pictures as I'm tooling about different places on my Facebook page there. So with that, Corky, do we have any questions?
We have one, and that question is, was broccoli cultivated from a type of a mustard?
That's a good question. I think broccoli would be one of the ones that's in one of the mustards as well. Broccoli and Romanesque. I have to admit that I'm not 100% sure of that, because there are some of our food plants are essentially taken from the cabbage family, and I'm not sure if broccoli is in the cabbage group or in the mustard group, and I apologize for not having that in mind.
Can't know it all, right?
Well, I tend to focus. My interest is primarily in native plants, so I have more information on natives than I do on the non-natives. And unfortunately, in the bypass, the majority of the things we run into are the non-natives. So I'm learning as we go along as well.
Absolutely. What was the plant you mentioned that you use as ground cover in your yard?
It's Phyla, Phyla nodiflora, or sometimes called Lippia, Lippia. And the common name for that, the most usual common name for that, is turkey tangle fog fruit. And if you go to a nursery looking for that, you won't find that. The cultivar that I have in my yard is something with the unfortunate name of Kurapia, Kurapia, which is a patented cultivar and tends to be fairly expensive, excuse me. And I got that from the Arboretum sale a number of years ago. And they put out a flat of those, and apparently it was gone in 10 minutes. And I got like the last 2 plants that they had the plant sale that particular year. I planted those 2 plants in my yard, and now it's covering my entire front yard. Probably because I'm watering it too much because I have other plants in my yard that need to be irrigated a little bit, and it grows very great. In fact, it's to the point where I'm trying to figure out how to keep it from taking over my neighbor's yard right now. I have some bush roses in my front yard, and if I don't trim this stuff back 3 or 4 times a year, I wouldn't be able to see those bush roses.
How do non-native plants get introduced?
A lot of different ways that non-natives come here. Some were brought on purpose. Some of the vetches were brought here for uses as cover crops. Probably the hyacinth was brought here because someone thinks it looks really pretty on their pond, which it can before it takes over your pond. So some things are brought in intentionally. You notice I didn't talk a lot about grasses in this talk, mainly because grasses are really difficult to identify sometimes and are lower on my list of interests because they don't have such pretty flowers. A lot of these came over because when the European settlers came in and they started bringing in cattle and sheep and animals, they brought over some of their feed with them to keep them fed on the ship or however they got here. And some of those non-natives were actually planted in the Central Valley on purpose so that they have some forage for their animals. And it's been said that the Central Valley was at one time the world's largest non-native garden, where they brought in, where the grasses have just taken over. The non-native grasses are a big problem in many of our grasslands in California. Because the weather here is just like what they had back in North Africa and Italy, in Spain and these areas. So a lot of them came over as attached to the fur of the animals or mixed in with the food that they brought over. Also, back in the 1800s, they didn't have a great way to separate the weed seeds from the seeds that they wanted to have. So your wheat and rye and things like this would have a lot of contaminant seeds in there because they couldn't get rid of them in Europe. They'd bring this over and plant all their wheat and stuff, and that introduced these non-native plants. We have some plants that move around by birds. I don't have a good example of one that's been brought into California, at least not in mind, but it's interesting to note that there are some plants that we have in our vernal pool areas in California that the only other place in the world that these plants exist is in Chile, in the vernal pools there. And the thought is that the birds ate the seeds here in California and then in their regular migration down to South America, took the seeds down there. And I'm sure that the same kind of thing can happen in the reverse, where some plants are brought in through the gut of birds. And there's probably some other ways. Some of these plants are very aggressive. But we just have this really nice Mediterranean climate that the mild, wet winters, hot, dry summers that matches other places in the world where people have been coming from, and they brought the plants with them one way or another.
What is the approximate yearly cycle for rice in the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area? For example, when is it harvested?
You might have a better answer for that.
Sure. Yeah, so I can answer that.
Yeah.
The rice is planted in the spring, and that depends somewhat on whether we flood it or not when it's put in. I mean, depending on whether it's wild rice or the domestic white rice, depends on how long it has to grow. But generally, the harvesting takes place in the fall. So you'll see the plains planting, say, April, sometimes May, Wild rice grows faster, so it has about a 90-day growing. The sushi rice has about 120 days to grow to ripeness. So most of the harvesting takes place usually around September or so. All
And they
right.
harvest them in different ways. Isn't the wild rice is harvested wet?
The wild rice is harvested wet. They've done some experimentation with harvesting it dry, but it tends to, the length of the grain and having it not break seems to work better when they harvest it wet, but that takes really special equipment, and it's much slower. So there's a cost exchange there.
Yeah, and the wild rice tends to shatter much more easily than the cultivated, the white rice.
Absolutely. Does curly dock look red in the fall?
Yeah, it gets a lot of plants. The leaves tend to change color as the season goes through, because the green chlorophylls tend to break down faster than the red chlorophylls. So when they're turning color, the green chlorophylls are dying out, and the red chlorophylls, which are less efficient, are a little bit hardier. So yeah, they can get quite red sometimes.
Is there something in the wetlands that people call wild carrot?
Wild carrot would be another name for the Queen Anne's lace. So Queen Anne's lace is Daucus carota is the Latin name, the scientific name for that. And that, I didn't go into that one too much because, again, I keep on looking for it. I really would like to find it out there, but I haven't been able to find it for sure. But that's a plant, again, that has a long association with people. It has a fairly robust root, and our orange carrots, our supermarket carrots, are derived from Daucus carota. Those were bred in Holland, which is one of the reasons why they bred for that nice orange color, because orange is the national color for Holland. And but the wild carrot that is the non-native one that's supposed to be out there is that Queen Anne's lace.
So related to that question, answer is, what's the main difference between Queen Anne's lace and toothpick weed to identify the two?
I wish I had pictures to show, but I haven't found the plant. The seeds of the Queen Anne's lace are going to be fuzzier. The seeds of the toothpick weed are fairly smooth. So every time I see the plants out there, if they're dried up, I'm grabbing the seed heads and looking at them to see. Unfortunately, you have to look really closely. You have to have a close-up lens or a hand lens to see that. The stems of the Queen Anne's lace should also, most of the time, be essentially fuzzy, a little bit of bristly, not bristly like the wild lettuce or something that is painful, but a strong fuzzy. And the ones I'm seeing out there, they're all relatively smooth. And again, it's a matter of degree, which makes it difficult to tell them apart.
Okay. And some years we see a ton of sunflowers out there, and other years a lot of mustard. Doesn't seem to be both in the same year. Any ideas why? And thank you for the great presentation, by the way.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's hard to keep me quiet sometimes. I can't give a real specific answer. In general, different plants have different requirements for the timing of when things are wet, how much water there is, what time of year things dry up. If we have a flooding event out there, that'll change the time of year when things dry out. And some plants just sprout naturally in different times of year. They need different day lengths. So I think probably it's going to be mostly moisture that affects things out there. There may be some other factors, but that's not something I've studied a lot. But we see that with a lot of the other plants. The Downingia, the nice purple native one that I talked about, is very dependent on the timing of the rainfall and the volume of rainfall.
Are all the hiking trails on the map available to the public? And I'll take that one too. They are available to the public. They are mowed, so they're all pretty much maintenance roads that are mowed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So sometimes they do look a little overgrown. But this time of year, all of those trails on the map that are marked are open. And we're actually working on a new map because they are trying to add a few other little routes that people might enjoy.
You might mention that some of those trails are not open all year round because they're in the areas that are closed for waterfowl hunting during hunting season. Yeah,
hunting season is mid to end of October until around the middle of February. So they're open now, but in the wintertime, some of those trails are not. And on that map, it's designated by the red dashed line. And you can find that map on our website. Well, I'm talking about that map, actually. I also want to mention that we do have a activity that's going to be coming up pretty soon. It's a scavenger hunt through the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. And there's going to be 10 different stations scattered throughout the map. And we just put the webpage just went live. Just trying to get people out. It's going to be the 3 weeks from the 20th of March until mid-April. And the idea for that is that it's crossing the spring breaks for the various school districts throughout our area. Hoping that families get out. It's something you can do all by yourself, or you can do it with your own little pod. And there'll be clues and information and all kinds of fun stuff. So let's see, coming back to your questions, we got a couple more on here. We have is the toothpick in the carrot family?
Yes.
Okay. And says, yeah, I think this is a comment here. My daughter, 5.5, watched and listened intently the whole time. She loves plants and especially flowers and is ready to go flower hunting with you.
I wish we could do things in purpose this time of year. Or things are just starting to get going out there, and there are some very nice places you can walk. Depending on how far you want to go, but you can do it right from your car because a lot of these plants are right up close to the road, if not in the road.
All right, looks like we've hit all the questions on the list here. Thanks so much, Charlie. Great information. You had people definitely interested because I was watching the numbers and people were not falling off the list. So pretty impressive that you're able to keep the attention of all the people. Again,
just everyone fell asleep, right?
Yeah. Again, I do want to send a little shout out for Flyway Nights for April 1st, our vernal pool program. We're going to have a short speaker series about vernal pools and especially about the vernal pools at Grasslands Regional Park. But the program's going to be kicked off about vernal pools in general. And it's going to be by Eva Butler, who is the founder for the Splash program and the vernal pools out at Mather, the old Mather Air Force Base. So thank you, Charlie. Thank you to everybody. You have lots of comments coming in. I don't think you can see chat from your end, unfortunately, but lots and lots of lovely comments coming in. Thanking you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. So I hope everybody gets out there, looks around. Come join us for the scavenger hunt or just go explore on your own. Have a great evening.